Oh, okay. All right. So, did I not? Oh, there. So we are back after lunch, after lots of drinking. We are going to continue on the theme that I started on Monday, the interplay between nonlinearity and variability. So the last time we talked about, whoops. Okay, it appears stuck.
Just click on this slide.
Hmm? Oh, perfect. Thank you. So yesterday we talked about the interplay between nonlinear local dynamics and spatial variation. Today we are going to talk about the interplay between nonlinearity and temporal variation. Now, the local nonlinearities we are going to consider are competition and consumer resource interactions. I'll probably likely only do competition today and then continue with consumer resource interactions tomorrow. Now, temporal variation here, we are thinking about the abiotic environment, in particular variation in temperature and the consequences of that variation in terms of climate warming. And in tomorrow's lecture, I hope to tell you something about using these, using mathematical models to make some predictions about how climate warming influences consumer resource interactions. Now today, I want to start with an important idea called the storage effect, developed by Peter Chesson. That's Peter Chesson when he was 26 years old in 1979, when he first developed the idea of the storage effect. And he doesn't look like that now. I almost put a picture, but I thought, so what I want to do is to talk about the storage effect and its mechanistic underpinnings. Now, the first thing I ask my students is, what do you understand by the term storage? So we want to be on the same. It's not like where you go put your stuff, the extra stuff that you have in your house. Well, that could be interpreted that way too. So it is the gain in reproduction during favorable periods of the environment that is stored in some way to be used in order to survive during unfavorable periods. So for example, if you have very long adult longevity, you can sort of average over these unfavorable periods. Dormant seeds in plants are very good examples of how plant species spend the unfavorable periods and survive to reproduce when the environment becomes favorable again. Okay? Now, there's been a lot of mathematical theory on the storage effect. And the theory sometimes seems very complicated and hard to test, hard to understand. The idea of the storage effect is very, very simple. And what I want to do is to give you a verbal definition, then I am going to try to formalize, okay? But not in the way Chesson does. This is my version of it. So the idea is very simple. Species experience little or no interspecific competition or interspecific interactions for that matter when they are rare, and they mostly experience intraspecific competition when they are abundant. What should that tell you right away from what we know based on my lectures earlier? Self-limitation is very important, right? So if you are mostly self-limited when you're abundant, what can you say about some sort of stable equilibrium? It's more likely than not, right? And that when you are experiencing a favorable environment, the effect of competitors on you is weak. So basically, during the favorable environment, you only engage in interactions with conspecifics, okay? All right, so that really is the essence of it. But the question is, okay, how does that happen in nature? Okay? Now, there are 3 requirements for this. And they're called, in Chesson's terms, the species, I will explain everything, species-specific responses to environmental variation, negative or no correlation, and be very careful about the wording here, between the favorability of the abiotic environment and the strength of interspecific competition. You understand what that means, right? When the environment is favorable to you, you experience very little interspecific competition. So if you were to look at it, there's either a negative correlation or no relationship. And then there's this last component, which is called buffered population growth, which is what enables you to get through what? This lecture? No. Unfavorable periods. Well, the lecture could be an unfavorable period. Now, everybody understood that, right? You have some sort of buffering to get through the bad times or the bad places. Okay, so what do we mean by species-specific responses to environmental variation? So here we are concerned with environmental variation that's mostly abiotic. So we are thinking of rainfall, temperature, pH, salinity, soil nutrient availability, things like that. And the point is that the environment that maximizes fitness is not the same for all the species, okay? So for example, colder versus warmer periods of the year. So some species maximize fitness during the colder parts of the year, some maximize fitness during the warmer part of, so either cold adapted or warm adapted. Or you could be living in the serpentine versus non-serpentine soil. How many people know what serpentine soil is? Not even the Italians. Oh, they are here. Thank goodness. Okay. Well, so it's a kind of soil that's high in sulfur, and it's very unfavorable to the growth of lots of species. There are species that are adapted to the serpentine that succeed there, but it's a very unfavorable environment for, say, seeds of plants that are not adapted to the serpentine. So that is the idea, that there are different times, and your fitness responds differently. Your maximum fitness is different at different times, or sort of or in different places. Now, the second thing is this covariance or the correlation between the environmental favorability and strength of interspecific competition. So essentially, when an environment that is favorable to a given species is unfavorable to its competitors. That is why if you do have these different responses to the environment, that's necessarily almost guaranteed, isn't it? Right? If you're better off in the cold environment, your competitor is better off in the warmer environment, what can that say about the correlation between favorability of the environment and the strength of interspecific competition? They're not positively correlated, right? If they're positively correlated, the environment, a biotic environment that's favorable to you should be the same environment that's favorable to your competitor. They're in their faces, like yesterday, in the so-sing kind of thing. They're in their faces, one will win. But the fact is they're separated in time or space because they maximize their fitnesses at different times of the year or different places in the environment. This idea applies to time as well as space, but I'm talking about this under temporal variation because I want to attribute a mechanism to it in terms of temperature variation. All right, so let's work through this. An environment favorable to one species is unfavorable to its competitors. What does that mean? What that implies is there's little or no interspecific competition during unfavorable periods for the competitor, right? Which are favorable periods for yourself. You understand? So they are favorable periods of the abiotic environment are separated. So when the environment is unfavorable to your competitor, are you going to experience much interspecific competition? No, because your competitor's doing badly to barely, it's so badly, it's barely surviving. It's undergoing buffered population growth at that time, okay? But what then happens is, since the favorable period of the environment to the focus species is different from the favorable environment to its competitor, that species can increase from small numbers, and it is going to be mostly limited by intraspecific competition when it's abundant. Are you following that? How many people feel comfortable with that logic? It's very simple, so yes. Oh, you are following? Yeah, okay, thanks. I thought you had a question. So that is why. So basically the idea is you do experience very little interspecific competition when the environment is unfavorable to your competitor but favorable to yourself. When the environment is favorable to yourself, the most of the competition you experience is from your conspecifics, which is better known as intraspecific competition. What does that give us in terms of local nonlinearities and stabilities of coexistence equilibria? That's going in the right direction of negative feedback, right? It's going in the right direction of negative feedback. So basically what that means is if you were to measure the strength of interspecific competition and the degree of favorability of the environment, you either find no correlation or a negative correlation, depending on how strongly linked they are. That's his second argument. That's Stesson's second argument. All right. And that's the hardest one. That's where all the covariance terms come in, because he does it in a statistical manner. But that, all that really means is that. And the third one is fairly easy. Everybody sort of heaves a sigh of relief when they come to this one. Species have a mechanism to survive the unfavorable environment. So if you're cold adapted, you really cannot deal with warm adapted times. You go to sleep, hibernate, estivate, or if you're a seed, you just go underground, right? So there has to be some way to buffer yourself survive during unfavorable periods of time. Now, if you think about it from a selection point of view, any organism that's persistent in such an environment, you might imagine has evolved some kind of adaptation to tide itself over in an unfavorable environment, correct? Otherwise, we wouldn't see it, right? If you always die in the winter without even leaving seeds or some kind of offspring, are you going to be present in the next generation? No, any mutant that does will replace you, okay? All right. So essentially then, the storage effect is a mechanism for temporal niche partitioning in terms that's framed very much in terms of species responses to abiotic environmental variation, okay? Now, there is in fact, so we say a storage effect is a mechanism of temporal niche partitioning, which is an idea of coexistence through temporal variation. Now, in fact, what we have is a hierarchy of mechanisms here. So we could say that the storage effect is a mechanism of temporal niche partitioning. There are other things, right? There's a refuge, for example, which has nothing to do with this or something to do with it sometimes. But there is a mechanism underlying the storage effect, which is that because the storage, why do I say there's a mechanism underlying the storage effect? Because it is something you observe at the population or community level, right? Who responds to the environment? Does the population as a whole? Yes, it does, but that's a mean field thing. Who responds? What is the interface between the organism and the environment? It's their life history trace, their phenotype, right? So if you really want to understand the storage effect, you have to do the mathematics that takes you from the individual level to the population level to the community level. So that is what this is about. And we know that basically based on first principles that what has to happen in order for the storage effect to allow species to coexist is, we know this already, right? We know what is required for coexistence. Our challenge is to show that it can happen, when it can happen, and when it cannot happen. And that's where we need the mathematical models. But we know already that the interplay between the abiotic environmental variation and competition should be such that intraspecific interactions are stronger relative to interspecific interactions, okay, on the relevant time scale. Now, yes?
So we're here always supposing that there's no time that's favorable for both the species involved?
Sorry.
I have a question from earlier, that we're always supposing that there's no time or stage that's favorable for both species involved?
In the extreme case, there is always going to be some overlap. But it should be the time they spend on their own, so to speak, should be large enough. What matters is, it doesn't matter what the overlap is, as long as the time they spend in their favorable sort of realms generates enough strong intraspecific competition to counteract whatever interspecific competition that occurs when their overlap is where it's favorable to one species and unfavorable to others. So it's not ever going to be the same sort of, most overlap is like that, but there will be some little overlap. So it is a matter of how much overlap there is, whether they are species adapted to their environments, in which case you would assume they've diverged, but it could be an interaction between a native species and exotic species, where you may not actually see that. But we are trying to find out when it works and when it doesn't. So that's a very good point. It's the degree of overlap of the favorability of the environment. So if you're very narrowly, you're a very narrow environmental specialist, you might be quite far apart from one another in terms of but if you're a thermal, say an environmental generalist, you might actually overlap with the other species and you may not get coexistence. So that's what we're trying to find out. There can be, depending on those kinds of what determines the nature of that species specific response, you can either get coexistence or not. And that very much depends on how they're adapted to their environments and whether they're native, in which case they are adapted to the abiotic environment and also to one another. I'll show an example from my own work later on. Or whether it's an interaction between a native and a recently arrived species, in which case there's no such coevolution. Okay? A lot of it has to do with coevolution. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the mechanistic basis of the storage effect with temperature as the axis of abiotic variation. Now, the reason I do that is temperature is one of the most important sources of environmental variation. Every community experiences some sort of temperature variation, and although it is the ectotherms, how many people know what ectotherms are? Oh, that's a minority. So these are species whose body temperature is dependent on the environmental temperature, everything apart from birds and mammals. Okay? So even though it is the ectotherms that are directly affected by temperature, endotherms are also affected through their interactions with resources and natural enemies that tend to be ectothermic. So it matters to all biodiversity. And last but not least, perturbations under this weight of the evidence on climate warming makes it even more important to understand how perturbations to the typical thermal environment influences population dynamics and species interactions. All right, so that's why that is the reason for using temperature as the axis of abiotic variation. Now, there's an interesting challenge involved in doing this. So we already know that species interactions exhibit these nonlinearities due to the density dependent feedback loops. Now what happens is that species also tend to exhibit nonlinear responses to abiotic variation, like temperature. So they have nonlinear, so you have to contend. So there's this interplay between these two types of nonlinearities that you have to resolve in order to really understand how species can coexist or not in these kinds of temporally varying environments. All right, so again, to remind you of the hierarchy we are looking at, that's the largest level. So the community level, you see temporal niche partitioning. At the species level, that occurs through, we are looking at this mechanism. There are a host of other mechanisms. The storage effect, at the individual level, what gives rise to the storage effect or not is the nature of species phenotypic traits. And I'll explain what these phenotypic traits are. Okay? Okay, so our goal is to predict the outcomes of temporal niche partitioning that occurs via the storage effect based on how temperature variation affects the underlying life history and consumption traits. So we start from the organism, ask how it responds to the abiotic variation, then ask how that translates into the next level and to the next level. Okay? All right. Right, so to do this, we have to start by characterizing the temperature responses of phenotypic traits. So now, just to be clear, life history traits are like birth, maturation, mortality. Consumption traits involve things like attack rate and handling times. Now, there are two types of, so from thermal biology, we can identify two types of trait responses to temperature. So on the one hand, we have these rate control responses that are driven by temperature effects on enzyme kinetics and reaction kinetics and enzyme inactivation. They give rise, so that's the mechanism at the biochemical level. These give rise to trait responses at the phenotypic level that are either monotonic increasing or left skewed. So mortality and maturation are very good examples. On the other hand, we have these, the second kind is the regulatory cycle responses. These are driven by negative feedback. So what happens is the rate processes on the left-hand, right-hand sides push the system towards an intermediate optimum. So we all know that there's most organisms have some physiological optimum at which they perform the best. So these traits are driven by, these trait responses are driven primarily by that negative feedback mechanism, where you have the extra involvement of neural and hormonal regulation of the reaction kinetics outcomes. Now, these give rise at the phenotypic level to more unimodally symmetric responses, and examples of these are birth and attack rates of ectothermic organisms. So to show you some data, these are the mortality responses for a whole host of different types of insects, and you can see that they are all monotonic increasing. These are the data for the temperature response of maturation or development from egg to adult, and you can see that they all, again, for lots of insects, insect parasites, beetles, fruit flies, mites, which are not insects but arthropods. How many people know what mites are? Yeah, good. Oh, well, 3 people, okay. So they exhibit this very characteristic left skewed response. Now, as opposed to that, we have, these are the temperature responses of reproductive traits, everything from ovary number to oviposition rate, and for an entire family, you can see of parasitoids here, insect parasitoids, and you can see that they are more symmetrically unimodal and well described by something like a Gaussian function. Okay? And then we have, these are the temperature responses of attack rates and the inverse of handling time, which is the maximum uptake rate for a large number of species, where these responses are somewhat scaled to fit on the same graph. This was done by Englund et al., they are Swedish scientists, in 2011. And you can see that these are also they're symmetric unimodal functions and not left skewed or monotonic increasing. Okay? So the thing is that what we find from, there are lots of large scale, at this point, very large scale data, several large scale data analysis to show us that the qualitative nature of these trait responses, whether they are monotonic increasing, left skewed, or symmetric unimodal, is conserved across ectotherm taxa. There's a reason why, because they are underlain by biochemical processes. Not every species is going to invent a different way of doing things if there is one way in which these things maximize fitness. So these are conserved just the way like the Hox genes are, or the MHC complex is conserved across different taxa. Okay? What that is really actually very encouraging, because what that means is that you can develop a trait-based framework that applies across lots of different ectotherm taxa living in different habitats and latitudes. Now, so the key question now is how do the temperature effects on phenotypic traits translate into the dynamics of species interactions, which is what we're interested in. And we do this by developing trait-based models of species interactions. And I'm going to do this again with our familiar exploitative competition between 2 consumers for a single resource. Now, you've seen this before. In a constant environment, we know that in this kind of system, the R star rule operates, and the consumer that has the lowest R star will win. What we are going to ask now is, how does exploitatory competition in the same system operate in seasonally varying thermal environments? Seasonal variation is everywhere. So that's where we start. So we develop a trait-based consumer resource model, which is exactly the same model, except everything is dependent on temperature, and temperature in turn is dependent on time, because temperature varies seasonally. What is the main mathematical difference between this model and the previous one then? It's non-autonomous, right? Now, outcome is not independent of initial conditions, and it also can be non-stationary depending on the kind of environmental variation you put in. So I'll tell you ahead of time, we use certain seasonal variation because that tends to give you a stationary distribution of abundances, provided seasonal variation stays approximately constant. When we deviate from that, we have to use some different metric. So the important thing about this model is that we use, so we see that every life history or consumption trait is a function of temperature and time. We incorporate mechanistic descriptions of these trait responses that are derived from first principles of thermodynamics. Thermal biologists have done that for nearly a century, so we can use these things and they fit the data very well. And the second thing is that the temperature is here determined by whatever the seasonal temperature regime of interest to you in the species you're studying. So you can do tropical, temperate, Mediterranean, whatever's interesting. So the thing we want to do to start is to look at mutual invasibility criteria in seasonally varying environments, and let me remind you that's a necessary condition for coexistence but not sufficient, right? What is the sufficient condition? You have to also show that the coexistence equilibrium is stable to perturbations, okay? We are clear on that, right? And I'm just showing this picture because this is work done with my erstwhile undergraduate, Daniel Smith, and we had a paper, actually his work, his undergraduate honors thesis ended up with a first author paper in the American Naturalist, and he is now he's a graduate student at the University of Chicago. So what we do is we take this model and we calculate the mutual invasibility criteria, which we now have to do because this is time varying, right? This is a time varying environment, so we have to calculate the time averaged per capita growth rate of the species, each species when it is rare and its competitor is at some stationary state with the resource. Obviously, there's no stable fixed point, right? This is non-autonomous. But there is generally, because we're thinking of system, I will get to that. So then, that is the general equation where this, that is the species attack rate, this is its mortality rate, and conversion efficiencies are stoichiometric quantities that are shown to be temperature independent. So for the purposes of these models, we consider them to be independent because the data are showing that to be the case. So the E's are independent and can eventually be taken out. But this quantity, I want you to focus on this quantity, which is the instantaneous resource availability set by the resident consumer in a seasonally varying environment. You could sort of kind of in a kind of a gloss over type of way say that it's time varying R star. But it's just the instant. So you realize what this invading consumer has to contend with. There is a time varying stationary state of the resident community, right? You have a resource and a consumer. And at any given time point t, it will experience that resource abundance that's been set by the resident consumer. It's just like the static case, except it's not a single number. So this is going to be important. Now, we need to find what that is. So that's the challenge. If you want to get an analytical expression, you need to find what that is. So we can make this interesting approximation. It works under these circumstances. If the consumers exhibit linear functional responses, which we are interested in this case because why? Because if you have nonlinear functional response, saturating functional responses, you have intrinsic oscillations. That can give coexistence due to, what did I say yesterday? Relative nonlinearity. Here we are interested in, can a temporal mechanism alone give coexistence in the absence of intrinsic fluctuation. So for that reason, we use the baseline to be type 1, and then we can add type 2 and ask what is the difference over and above that temporal mechanism, right? So we are going to, so if they have linear functional responses and the temperature variation, the seasonal temperature variation is predictable, which means that the mean and the amplitude stay approximately constant over time, then you can approximate that instantaneous resource availability set by the resident consumer by this quantity, which is still time varying. And we see that this is a very good approximation, and in fact, if you simulate the dynamics of the 3-species model, you get the exact same outcome. It's a nice approximation, will not work for climate warming, because then you don't have a predictably varying environment, right? Climate warming means some trend. All right, so then now we have this, we have substituted for that R star, time varying R star here. So that is our invasion criterion. In fact, the mutual invasibility criteria, where I is either I is species 1, J is species 2, you can take your pick. Now, we can just do some little algebra and move these integrals around to rewrite the mutual invasibility criteria this way. And it's nice to do this because that is essentially the consumer's lifetime reproductive success in a seasonal environment, which we know is like the R0, it has to exceed 1. So it's a nice metric to use. Okay? Plus, it tells us something very important, which I will point out later, about that quantity versus this quantity. Okay? All right. Now, okay, now we are going to go through some algebra exercise that I'm not going to bore you with. What we do is we go back here, we separate the time. See, like those responses have temperature independent components and temperature dependent components. We just take the independent things out and separate out the temperature independent terms from the dependent terms, and we can rewrite this thing. We can derive a sufficient condition for coexistence, which is everything, right? Sufficient condition is, that's what it takes to coexist in a seasonal environment. And that is given by this quantity where, so notice now, these are the ratios of the species R star values in a constant environment, okay? That's the constant environment. So we always have a constant part where the system will collapse to if there were no seasonal variation. If you had just your previous model we had, that is all we would have. And the, okay, so now notice these terms with primes here are the temperature dependent mortality and consumption rate responses, okay? Because I took the independent part out, so the primes here actually are denoting that is only the temperature dependent part. Obviously, that's inside the integral, okay? Everybody's following? It's, so I haven't shown you what these are, which I will later, but you can see these are all temperature dependent. Here's the independent part expressed as a ratio, and we get this nice sufficient condition. And from that, you know the necessary condition is the outermost expressions, right? This is the sufficient condition, then the necessary condition would be this. And it was not hats, it was prime. I dropped the primes. So just to make it more convenient for typing, actually more than anything else. But now these are the temperature dependent components. So we have the necessary condition entirely in terms of temperature dependent parameters. Now, what we can do is then do some really nifty thing with this. We look at, okay, here's something I want to tell you. So these are non-autonomous equations. You can get these nice closed expressions for invasion criteria. You can bumble through, calculate all these and say, hey, I got it. We did something different. We actually sat and looked at these things very carefully. What does this integral mean in terms of these organisms? What does this integral mean? What does their ratio then mean in terms of the biology? Because you see, that's a death rate. This is an attack rate of the second species. This is the resource availability it experiences when it's coming in. So this is what I would encourage you all to do, especially the physicists who are really enamored by the beauty of the equations. I am too. But I want to go one step further and say, well, what does it mean for the real world or some interesting question, right? So I could stop here and I said, I got my necessary condition, I got my sufficient condition, I analyze them, I get coexistence or not, I go home. No. We actually then looked at this very carefully and we came up, so we moved things around and we came up with this same condition but written in a different way. And this is very important for a reason. Now, before I tell you what that is, let's just get some things clear in our minds. So what is the importance of the necessary and sufficient conditions, and what do they say about exclusion, dominance, coexistence, and priority effects? So here's the scheme. If the necessary and sufficient conditions are both satisfied, then species will limit themselves more than they do others. You get stable coexistence, right? Everybody agrees with that. The sufficient condition is the stability condition. If the necessary condition is the only one that is satisfied, that means one species excludes the other, you get competitive dominance. If neither the necessary nor the sufficient condition is satisfied, the outcome depends on initial conditions, you get priority effects. So this is the beauty of this, right? It's a complete description of the outcomes of competition in any environment, but here we are concerned with. Now, the reason, so here's why writing it, looking at this for a long time, tearing out our hair, and it paid off because what we find is this is equivalent to the necessary condition for mutual invisibility in the Lotka-Volterra framework. So by looking at this very carefully, we were able to actually mechanistically derive the alphas in terms of species consumption and mortality rates. How beautiful is that? So you can actually say a species with this attack rate and this mortality rate will have a certain intra versus interspecific effect. Okay? So that was why it was worth looking at the equations, poring over them for days on end. Actually, this part didn't take that long. It was the later parts, you'll see. So then, okay, so I claim that here. So alpha II, the intraspecific, oopsie, is alpha II, which is the intraspecific competition coefficient, is given by this quantity. The alpha ji or ij, the interspecific competition coefficient, is given by this quantity. Now let me explain these things. So what's great is now, oops, as I said, we have a mechanistic derivation of the competition coefficients alpha based on the species consumption and mortality rates. Okay, so let's go through them and try to understand them. So alpha II, the intraspecific competition coefficient, is inversely proportional to the consumer's time averaged mortality rate. So what is the inverse of the time averaged mortality rate? Somebody tell me. That's a sort of very important thing.
The mean lifetime?
Exactly. So that's the mean lifetime, and that means the longer you live, the more resources you can take up, right? So that means if this is small, if the denominator is small, you live long and you limit yourself much longer, more strongly. What is really interesting is that it comes out just through mortality, just through longevity. Okay? Okay, interspecific competition. Interspecific competition is inversely proportional to this quantity. Now look at this quantity very carefully. This is the invading species, consumer 1 or consumer 2, whoever is rare, consumption rate, right? That's his temperature response of the consumption rate, times the resource availability set by the resident consumer. It's the product of that that determines the interspecific competition coefficient. Your ability to acquire resources, which is your own competitive ability, times the resource availability set by your competitor, which is its effect on you, right? There's this tension between the two. You might be very good at getting resources, but your competitor is very good at setting the resource level to be very low. Do you see? Do you see how, if you were following, hopefully, the R star, all these ideas about depleting resources come into play here with double the force. So that is what we get. So we have a really good understanding of how these things happen in terms of individually measurable traits. Question?
Can we extrapolate these results to other kinds of models?
Yes, I will get to that once I have finished, okay? The short answer is yes, we've done community modules with it. Other apparent competition, tritrophic food chain, But you do have to make that approximation. There's an approximation involved, which is actually a very, very good one as approximations go, but you still have to make it. All right, so, oh, no, it's not. Oh, here. All right, so then we see from the equations, mutual invisibility in a seasonal environment comes down to two factors, obviously. Intraspecific competition, which is determined by the invader's mortality rate, the time average mortality rate. Interspecific competition, which is determined by two things. The resource availability set by the resident consumer, which would be its R star in a constant environment, and its time varying R star, which itself depends on the resident species consumption and mortality rate. Remember, the R star is the death rate over the birth rate, right, essentially? So, and then the second thing that determines the strength of interspecific competition is the invader's resource acquisition ability, which is determined by its attack or consumption rate, okay? Now, so what that means is temperature effects on invasion success is determined by how, so invasion success is determined by how temperature affects resource availability, resource consumption, and mortality. That's what we have to understand. Now is the time to look at these mechanistic descriptions of these temperature responses. So, the temperature response at the mortality rate is, in all ectotherms, follows this pattern above the critical limit, the lower critical limit below which they are not viable, okay? And that's given by the Boltzmann-Arrhenius function, where dTi is the mortality rate, sort of a baseline mortality rate at TR, which is a reference temperature, generally between 20 and 30. And AD here is the Arrhenius constant, which determines how sensitive the mortality rate is to temperature, meaning how fast or slowly mortality increases with temperature. Now, we are going to really want to remember this. So, it determines what I call temperature sensitivity of mortality, which is how fast or slowly the mortality increases with temperature. Right. Now, the temperature response of the consumption rate, as we saw from the data, is well approximated by a Gaussian function, where AT opt is the maximum consumption rate, which occurs at the species physiological optimum, physiologically optimal temperature. Most organisms have a physiological optimum. And the S sub A here is a measure of the response breadth, the temperature range over which the species can consume resources, okay? So, of course, if you have a wider response breadth, you're much better at getting, you're able to get procure resources over a wider temperature range. If you have a narrow response, it's the opposite. Now, what is really important is that this is how we get to the results of how storage effect allows coexistence. Relative strengths of intra and interspecific competition depends on the nature of thermal adaptation. What is thermal adaptation? It is how species adapt, how species consumption and mortality rates adapt to the thermal environment they live in. Selection will always maximize the kind of temperature. Selection will drive the population to some average reaction norm or a temperature response that maximizes fitness on average. So, so that is what you expect. So that is thermal adaptation, that maximizing of fitness with the response that maximizes fitness is thermal adaptation. Now, so the nature of thermal adaptation. So there are two dimensions to this. It's very interesting. Cold adapted species they generally have lower thermal optima. Makes sense, right? They are better at colder temperatures, and they're active at lower temperatures, obviously. Warm adapted species have higher thermal optima, and they're active at higher temperatures. Now, the second dimension to thermal adaptation is thermal specialists, which have a narrower response breadth, meaning they are active only during a narrow temperature range. Lots of species are like that, as opposed to thermal generalists, which have wider response breadth and are therefore active over a wider temperature range. So, these two are really important aspects of thermal adaptation. Now, with that in mind, let's look at intraspecific competition. Remember, the intraspecific competition coefficient is inversely proportional to the species time average mortality rate. The mortality rate looks like that. That's the temperature responsive mortality. Okay? So it is this function that you're going to average over the year. So actually I forgot to say tau is the 365 days. So we do it across over the time period of a year because we're interested in seasonal variation. Now, let's look at the mortality responses of cold adapted versus warm adapted species. So remember the mortality response goes like that. So of course, because since the mortality increases with temperature, it necessarily means that cold adapted species will have lower mortality than warm adapted species, right? That's the nature of the experiment. Everybody, I mean, it would be a huge problem if that weren't true, right? Because it's exponentially increasing. But what does that mean? Strength of self-limitation is the inverse of the average mortality rate, right? So that means if you're cold adapted, you are more strongly self-limited than if you were warm adapted. That's the beauty of it, because these temperature responses translate into your ability to limit yourself versus limit other species. Now, interspecific, so that's intraspecific competition. Interspecific competition is determined by two things. Remember, it's the resource availability set by the resident, its time varying R star, which depends on the resident's consumption and mortality rates, and the invader's resource acquisition rate, which is the invader's consumption rate. So now we want to see how the interplay between those matter to determine the strength of interspecific competition. So the resource availability set by the resident species is a function of the resident's consumption and mortality rates. We see that the mortality rate is exponential, the consumption rate is a Gaussian, and which means that the resource availability set by the resident consumer has a temperature response that's sort of like this inverted J-shaped mirror image of a J, like a sort of a cutoff U function. Okay, so that means lower resource availability at lower temperatures, high resource availability at higher temperatures. So that's going to be very important. Now, yeah.
What happens with the first part? On the first part, close to 280. It's upper.
Oops. Sorry.
It's higher there, and then.
You mean no? So it will actually go to a limit. So it's really the R star is the death rate response divided by the birth rate response, right? So the reason you have this to be like this is because at colder temperatures both are small, right? And then as you go up, what happens is the mortality increases, attack rate decreases. So it increases overall, okay? So that's why you have it. So when it's cold, when the temperatures are lower, mortality is low, but the attack rate is also low because it's below the optimum, right? So generally it's a lower quantity. At high temperatures, mortality is very high and the attack rate is low because attack rate is symmetrically unimodal. So you have a high resource availability, because remember the resource availability is given by the inverse of your, so it's basically your death rate response divided by your birth rate response, okay? Right. Now, let's look at the resource availability set by the resident consumer when it's cold adapted versus warm adapted. Now notice if you're cold adapted, on average, you have a low use, the resource availability you set to the invader is very low, right? Your R star, time averaged R star is quite low because it's in this realm. As opposed to a warm adapted species where the resource availability, so what can you say? This is a very efficient competitor, this is a not very efficient competitor, right? Right, because it has a higher resource availability, it sets a higher resource availability, which means something can come in more easily here than here. Do you agree? Right, because it's this is the time averaged R star. So what that means is that cold adapted species depress resources to lower levels than warm adapted species. Right. So there we have. So let's look at those two things together. cold adapted species experience stronger self-limitation than warm adapted competitors. They are warm adapted competitors. Cold adapted species deplete resources to lower levels and therefore have lower time varying R stars than do their warm adapted competitors. We are getting somewhere with that storage effect idea. Okay? It's not there yet. Now, so we said that thermal optima constitute one dimension of thermal adaptation. The other one is response breadth. So if you now look at the mortality responses of thermal specialists and thermal generalists. So specialists are active over a narrower temperature range, which means that they experience lower average mortality and stronger self-limitation than thermal generalists because they are active over a wider temperature range and therefore have a larger mortality response, right? Because it's concave up. The more variability you experience, the higher and higher mortality translates into weaker self-limitation. So what this translates to is that thermal specialists experience stronger self-limitation than thermal generalists. What about resource availability set by thermal specialists versus thermal generalists? So this is that like that odd, the mirror image of the J-shape function for the time varying R star. So thermal specialists are active over a narrow temperature range compared to thermal generalists, which means obviously the thermal specialists have on average lower resource availability. They deplete resources to a lower level than thermal generalists. Okay, so let's look at that together. Thermal specialists limit themselves more than their generalist competitors. Thermal specialists deplete resource to a lower levels, have lower R stars than do their generalist competitors. Right. So now we can get to the mechanistic basis of the storage effect in seasonally varying environments. Species, this is very important. This is something that makes Chesson very accessible in a real way. Or Chesson's idea. Chesson's pretty accessible. Species that exert strong interspecific competition. For example, cold adapted species or thermal specialists, because why do they exert strong interspecific competition? Because they have lower R stars, right? If you have a lower R star, that means you have set the resource server to be so low, it's very hard for something to come in, right? Here's the beauty of it. Species that can exert strong interspecific competition are also the species, by virtue of their mortality response, that are more self-limited. And therefore, exist only weak interspecific competition than those, compared to those that exert only weak interspecific competition, such as the warm adapted species and thermal generalists. Essentially what that means is if you have a strong if you exert strong competition on the other species, your longevity in a seasonally varying environment will ensure that you limit yourself more than you limit the other species. Now, what is the underlying requirement, essential requirement? Their favorable environments are different, right? Either you're cold adapted or warm adapted in this scenario, or you're a thermal specialist or a thermal generalist. You're experiencing a different portion of that environment. Now, so what we want to do is, so that's really sort of interesting, but can we develop some testable predictions? And in fact, testable predictions that can apply to things other than plants. Most of the theory has been well developed for plants, but I happen to study insects. I would like a theory that can apply to insects, and among other things. So what we want to do now is we want to scale these temperature response parameters in terms of the seasonal temperature regime. And the great outcome of this would be you're going to end up with very, very few parameters, and they are all parameters you can measure. Now, there are 3 empirical observations that are going to help us with this. First, there is the difference between the mean habitat temperature and the species physiological optimum. That difference tends to increase with increasing latitude. And that's from empirical data. So let me give you an example. Here's a tropical species. These are birth rate responses for tropical and temperate species. You can see the dashed line is the mean habitat temperature. The solid line is the optimal temperature. These are real data from real species. You can see they practically coincide in tropical species, right? The deviation between the mean, why? Because they experience so little fluctuations, they maximize fitness by being at the mean, because the mean is what you experience all the time, right? Does that make sense? Right? So it's a natural, that's how you maximize fitness. But look at the temperate species. The optimum is much, much higher than the mean habitat temperature. So that's why as you go up in latitude, that difference tends to increase. The second thing, response breadth. How much of a thermal generalist you are also tends to increase with latitude for the obvious reason. To be better adapted to a fluctuating environment, you need to be active over a large range of temperatures so you can catch the good times and tide over the bad times, right? Right. Now, then the next one is, so here are real data from tropical and temperate species. You can see the tropical species has a lower response breadth compared to the temperate species. Okay, so two things, optima, response breadth, all things you can measure as you can see. And the third thing is species tend to differ in their temperature sensitivity of mortality, that Arrhenius constant. And here again are some data. For temperate, Mediterranean, and tropical, you can see the slope of this curve tends to change quite a bit. Okay? So here's a fairly shallow response. There are more steep responses. So three things that change between your putative competitors. And we are going to make use of this to test the for any kind of temporal partitioning, but also the storage effect. So now we are going to scale. So let's say MT denotes the mean habitat temperature. So it is, I don't know, 25 degrees Celsius, which will be, I think in Kelvin, that's 298. And AT is the amplitude of seasonal fluctuations. Now you can get these data for any place, any location through NOAA, like there are lots of websites where you get those data. Okay? Then let's say, we will just say with our loss of generality that consumer 1 is the resident species and consumer 2 is the invader. You can switch it, nothing gets lost. So the resident, we can say then the resident consumer's consumption rate we can express in terms of that deviation, mean temperature plus some M, which is positive, right? If you're in the tropics, what would M be? No, 0, because you're at the, when you're in the tropic, your optimum is at the mean temperature. Remember, so this M represents how far away you are from the mean temperature. Do you see? It's a really nice metric because then you can compare across, because say, okay, you say a species optimum is, I don't know, 301 Celsius. Does that mean anything to you? But if you said it's 3 degrees above the mean, that might mean something to you because that shows you that, or you can compare it across another species, right? And then we can do the invader's consumption, the optimum, as a deviation from the residence, and we say that X is the deviation between the two species, and that's what we want. That's what we want because that tells you how different they are in their thermal optima. We can do the same thing with the response breadths. Let's say V is the ratio between the invaders and the resident's response breadth. So if V is greater than 1, the resident has a wider, is a thermal generalist compared to the, the invader is a thermal generalist compared to the resident. If it's less than 1, it's the other way around. So right away you can know something about your species. The third thing is the scaling of the temperature sensitivity and mortality. We take the ratio of, we say P is the ratio of the Arrhenius constants of the invader and the residents, temperature sensitivity and mortality, and if P is larger than 1, you have one thing. B is the invader is more sensitive to temperature, its mortality is more sensitive to temperature, and vice versa. Now, what's really nice about that is we have now expressed these things in terms of metrics that can be measured for any species, and you can compare them. You could say X is for this species, and X is this for this species from the tropics and the temperate. It has some meaning because it's a deviation, right? And the ratios. So now what we are going to do is we are going to incorporate these scaling relationships into the necessary condition, do like 500 pages of algebra, and you're going to get this. But what's great about this is that this is a mechanistic description of the mutual invisibility criteria consisting entirely of measurable parameters. Now, I don't know whether you can read it, but I will show you that this is actually only 5 parameters. You have the abiotic parameters, which is the temperature regime, mean, and amplitude, which you can find out if you didn't measure it yourself. There are lots of databases, and the biotic ones are the difference between the 2 consumer species in their thermal optima, response breadth, and temperature sensitivity and mortality. Only 5 parameters. Only 3 that you have to measure. So what's really important about this finding is that density independent mortality, which drives intraspecific competition, is crucial to coexistence in seasonally varying environments. We sort of knew this, but we never really appreciated what that meant. So what our trait-based model does is to provide a mechanism for the species-specific responses to temperature in terms of the temperature sensitivity of mortality primarily, but also in terms of the optima and response breadths. Now, so we can make some predictions based on what we found out earlier. We would expect mutual invisibility to be possible if a cold adapted species, which has lower thermal optimum, experiences greater temperature sensitivity to mortality, has a steeper mortality curve. Okay, so why does that work? I might have to draw this on the board for you. Why does that work? If you're a cold adapted species, you have a steeper mortality. How many people can draw these things in their heads? A steeper exponential curve and a lower attack rate at higher temperatures. Warm adapted species has a shallower mortality curve and a higher attack rate at higher temperatures. So let's see. So what is a steeper mortality curve? A steeper mortality curve is like you go like that, okay? A shallower mortality curve is when you go like that, right? Now, then if you're cold adapted, what you have is your mortality curve goes like that, and your attack rate goes like that, because actually I didn't do that right, because you're not going to go into the warm realm, so your attack rate might go like this, right? You can see it has a huge advantage when it's cold, right? And especially if the temperature sensitivity of mortality is high, right? The more steep the curve is relative to its attack rate response, the better it's going to do, because its optimum is always here. You understand, right? Now look at the opposite of the warm adapted species. Now it has a shallower response, right? Which means mortality is high, relatively high here and not that high there, and its response is over here, okay? That's its net gain. This is net gain. You can already see, even with my bad cartoon, the difference. If you really put real values, you would see this difference better. Now, let's look at that. Oops. So what does that mean? A steeper mortality curve means lower mortality at lower temperatures and stronger self-limitation during favorable periods of the year, right? If you're cold adapted and you have a steeper mortality curve, that means mortality during colder temperatures is very, very low, but it increases very fast, right? It's going to do very badly when it's warming. Like climate warming will kill this thing off. But for the moment, the cold adapted species then is going to be very strongly self-limited if a lower thermal optimum is coupled with what? A higher temperature sensitivity of mortality. So low X and high P. Second, but a steeper mortality rate curve also means higher mortality at higher temperatures, right? If you're steeper, you're going to have high mortality very quickly because it's a very steep exponential curve. What does that do to the amount of resources it will, the level to which it will deplete resources? That combined with a lower attack rate at higher temperatures. So you have very high mortality, very low attack rate. What can you say about this area? It's going to have a, what is it going to have? It is going to lower attack rate at higher temperatures, increases the cold adapted species R star, leading to weaker competition on the warm adapted species when the thermal environment is favorable to the warm adapted species, right? So when the environment is favorable to the warm adapted species, which is when you are at this end, you have such high mortality on the cold adapted species that it cannot exert much competition, because the warm adapted species has its favorable moment when the cold adapted species is dying, right? That was the whole point of the separation. So basically what that means is, to summarize, that the lower attack rate optimum and greater temperature sensitivity of mortality means that the cold adapted species limits itself much more strongly than it will limit the warm adapted competitor. Okay, so now let's look at the warm adapted species. So a shallower mortality curve means lower mortality at higher temperatures and stronger, that means lower mortality means what? Stronger self-limitation during the time that's favorable to the warm adapted species, right? Because it's on the other side. And a shallow mortality curve also means higher mortality at lower temperatures, right? Here you have higher mortality because you have a shallower mortality curve, and at that point, because it's warm adapted, its attack rate is also quite low, right? So what does that mean? That means that the warm adapted species is going to have a higher R star on that end, leading to weak competition on the cold adapted species when the environment is favorable to the cold adapted species. Okay, so to summarize, a higher attack rate optimum and a lower temperature sensitivity of mortality. So it's a trade-off between some aspect of attack consumption rate and some aspect of mortality, right? Which are very common. So longevity, fecundity type trade-off. And that means that the warm adapted species will then also limit itself more than it limits its cold adapted competitor. So what you get then is thermal adaptation will naturally, of this type, will naturally lead to a negative covariance between the favorability of the abiotic environment and the strength of interspecific competition, okay? So let's just, so there's something very interesting. So we talked about that's coexistence, but remember there is also competitive dominance and priority effects. Priority effects are very important. So can we also then specify the conditions under which you might get priority effects? So here is some start on that. When the cold adapted species are more sensitive to temperature effects on density, so this is density independent mortality. This is not due to something else. This is just your natural death rate in the presence of temperature changes. And if it's more sensitive to temperature than a warm adapted species, the necessary condition is always going to be met. The necessary condition will always be met. And that means if this trade-off operates, if there is something like a fecundity or consumption mortality trade-off, priority effects are not going to be possible. So that's a powerful result because you can actually test that in the field, and I'll show you an example. All right, so the conditions for priority effects then is the opposite. If the cold adapted species are less sensitive, so if you draw these curves the other way, then the necessary condition will not be met. If the necessary condition is not met, what do you get? Outcomes are dependent on initial conditions. All right. So what's really nice is then we can then use these trace-based invisibility criteria to predict the conditions for coexistence, competitive dominance, and priority effects in thermally varying environments. Right. Now, okay, that's all well and good. I've been saying a lot about how things should be relevant to the real world, right? So what we actually did was we tested these predictions with data from an insect host parasitoid community that I've been studying since I was a graduate student. So this is a system. You have this insect, the harlequin bug, and its eggs are attacked by 2 species of insect parasitoids. So these are wasps. How many people know what wasps are? Whoa! How many people do not know what wasps are? Are you serious? Okay. Well, you can look it up. But they are parasitic Hymenoptera. They are parasitic wasps. Anyway, so they have this interesting thing. They compete for, so they are fairly large insects. They can only use this species eggs. So they're really competing for this limiting resource, right? Okay. So when I was a graduate student, I started studying this system. I was really interested in asking this question of how do they coexist on this common host. They are taxonomically very different. They're from different families. And there's only this one resource. How can they coexist? So what you find is that if you bring them to the lab and you put them together, that second species, this species, Oencertus, excludes Tricercus within a matter of 23 days. Every single time, 23 days, it gets excluded. In the field, these species have coexistence for decades and decades, and they exhibit this very interesting pattern that suggests the possibility of temporal partitioning. So here's Tricercus. It comes up. It looks like it might be more cold adapted. It comes up. Its parasitism rate increases. Then around April, Oencertus emerges, and then Tricercus's numbers go down. At the end of the year, winter sort of resets the system. It goes on again. And there's, of course, seasonal variation. It's a Mediterranean climate. Now, so what we did was we have this data going back for many years, and we've done these tedious temperature experiments on every single character of these species. And we were able to, although, I mean, you can actually get those kinds of data available in the entomological literature. You could actually do these things easily. What we found out was this. The parasitoids are very similar response breadth. So the V is 0.98, but they differ in their attack rate optima by about 1 degree, or it's not 1 degree, it's 1 degree in terms of deviations, okay? In real absolute terms, they are actually different about 4 degrees. And the temperature sensitivity of mortality, and what is really, really interesting is, without going into the gory details, the species with the low attack rate optimum, the one that was onto the left-hand side, exhibits greater temperature sensitivity of mortality. So we said then, that means the necessary condition for mutual invasive. So these are just data, right? These didn't come from the model. These are just data from the experiments, okay? Just to be very clear, that did not come out from any model. But we can now look at this and say, well, in that case, the necessary condition for mutual invasibility should be satisfied, right? Because we saw that if they have that trade-off, it works, and that priority effect should not be possible. So then what we did was, we parameterized the necessary condition with these data for the, remember you only needed 3 parameters of the species, and you needed the seasonal temperature regime. I got all those data. Okay, so look at this carefully. In each of these graphs, the black curve is the left-hand side of the necessary condition, you know, the 2 products, right, with the integrals. The right-hand side is 1. So the green is the right-hand side, which is 1, and this is the actual left-hand side of the necessary condition. What has it got to be? It's got to be less than 1, remember? It had to be, if you don't believe me, here. It has to be less than 1, right? What do you see? For the optima actually occur here is 1.01, and it does satisfy the necessary condition on the basis of optima. And then we looked at the harder one, which was the response breadth, because the P's were so different that it was guaranteed to be, it is guaranteed to be satisfied. But look at the response breadth. Again, we are plotting the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, and for their response breadth, which are quite similar, they still satisfy the necessary condition. Now, do they satisfy the sufficient condition? So here, what we did is, so here the black curve here is the invasion boundary for Tricercus. The red curve is the boundary for Oencertus. The gray region is where they coexist. Here's where the mean values of the parameters lie. The mean is just above the coexistence region, but the variability around it is quite large, right? And it's the same thing for difference when you look at the response breadth, where the mean value is just above the coexistence region, but the variability in that mean, around the mean, the natural variability, so genetic or phenotypic variation in these organisms is quite large. So then what we did was we took that variability and we did 10,000 random samples within that variability, and we plotted remember, like in the sufficient condition, you have in the middle the temperature independent quantity. So we looked at those ratios, we calculated those ratios, and we plotted this frequency distribution. This is the coexistence range. Here's the mean value, which is just outside of the coexistence range, but the distribution of values certainly includes the coexistence range, which means that the system exhibits sufficient variability that coexistence should be possible, right? Right. Now, it is one thing further. So what we did is, now here are the monthly parasitism patterns we get when we parameterize a dynamical model of this system, not the invasion criteria, the real dynamics of the system. And that's what we get. So this is monthly parasitism rate per a year. This is Tricercus, this is Oencertus, and this is what we see in the field. So there's a pretty good match of what happens in the field. The model does a fairly good job of capturing what's happening in the field and what it predicts on the, now remember, we did not use any field data to parameterize this model. The model was parameterized completely based on experimental data from lab experiments. So it's a completely independent comparison. None of these data were ever used to do anything with the model. All right, so let me summarize. So what we do is, so we've looked at exploitative competition in seasonally varying environments, and we've done this by deriving mutual invasibility criteria in terms of mechanistic descriptions of trait responses to temperature. So looking really at what happens below the level of an individual organism and scaling that up. And what we find is really interesting results. The exponential nature of the mortality response, which is simply a biochemical thermodynamical phenomenon, causes self-limitation strength to decrease with increasing temperature, which means that cold adapted species and thermal specialists tend to experience stronger intraspecific competition than warm adapted species and thermal generalists. Second, this exponential nature of the mortality response translates into a lower R star because of the way mortality changes, and stronger interspecific competition at temperatures below the attack rate optimum than above it. Remember, mortality goes like this. That means your R star is lower below the attack. So which means that the cold adapted species and thermal specialists can exert weaker competition on and experience stronger competition from warm adapted species and thermal generalists. Right. So we can then derive the mechanistic basis of the storage effect in terms of, in a seasonally varying environment, in terms of the temperature effects on life history and consumption rate. Species-specific responses arise from temperature effects on biochemical processes that underlie these phenotypic traits, and these trait effects translate into relative strengths of intra versus interspecific competition at the population level. And what's really nice about this, that we are very quite proud of, is that we can make testable predictions about population level patterns of coexistence based solely on trait response data and completely independent of any population level information. So it provides a very powerful way of testing these predictions against population level data. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
So now we have this short break, 10 minutes, and then we come back for the questions.
Oh, I can't change that. Oh.
can we use this theory to explain the Great American Periodic Interchange, in which most of the flux came from North to South America?
The fluid exchange, did you say, or faunal?
Both.
So I have actually used this framework to answer the biogeographic question of why the tropical species from lower latitudes are more successful at invading species from higher latitude habitats, whereas higher latitude species are not good at invading tropical habitats, and those data are present in both the extant data for extant taxa, but also in the fossil record. So there's this argument that tropics is called the tropics are a cradle versus and a museum. So species originated in the tropics, they move away from the tropics, they're pushed out because there are too many species. They adapt to a temperate environment, but they're able to adapt to a temperate environment going from the tropics, where you have very, very different temperature. But once they adapted to the temperate environment, they cannot come back. So there's something about, there is a directional movement, just like what you said. So it may well work. I can say that this is a paper just in press that we have about this latitudinal directionality in evolution success. It works for both ecology and evolution in terms of evolution as well. You can show that it's much easier for you to move to the temperate region and adapt to the temperate habitat than to come from the temperate region and adapt to the tropical habitat. So it's the same framework. Instead of looking at two competitors in the same thermal regime, you ask now, you have a resident community that's either temperate or tropical, then you ask what about an invader from tropics or temperate region coming to the opposite latitude? And then you ask, can it survive? And it turns out the buffered population growth is very critical. You have to survive the cold times and the warm times. Okay? Yeah, so you can certainly apply that. You can, I mean, it should be, it's very well tailored to that. Because of the scalings too, you don't have too many parameters. Yeah.
Hello, thanks
Hi.
for the lecture. Yeah. So my question is that your claim of non-linearity and variability leading to more diversity, right? For example,
sorry, I didn't say more diversity. I said that's diversity is an outcome of the interplay between nonlinearity and variability. It can be either high diversity or low diversity.
Okay, so
yeah.
that maybe breaks my question, but okay.
No, but I don't claim that. What I claim is whatever the diversity, so however you measure it, for number of species, Shannon-Weaver index, I'm saying all of what you observe is ultimately the result of the interplay between nonlinear dynamics and spatiotemporal variation. It could enhance it, it could decrease it.
Oh, okay, yeah, because the thing I would mention...
But ask your question anyway, because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, because, for example, in this temperature niching, for example, I would expect that regions with more temporal variability should then have more richness, right? But I know not much about biology, but I think one of the facts is that tropical regions have more species than subtropical regions and polar regions, for example.
That's an excellent question. I'm very glad you did ask it. So there's an answer for that. So what happens is, like as I was saying, remind me your name again, I'm the absent-minded professor. So, so this kind of actually follows up with that question. So it is easier for lower latitude ectotherms to colonize, invade higher latitude habitats. If that were true, and because there are lots of temporal niches you could argue, then we should end up with higher diversity in the temperate zone. But that is an argument based on the ecological component of this question. Once you go there, what happens is you adapt to the temperate climate, you become a generalist, and it's like the R-star rules. So if you just look at it, so a testable prediction of this is that you should see greater diversity in the temperate zone. When you see anywhere where you see greater diversity, it should be because of more recently invaded species, not because you have historically a large diversity of native species. Because I've been doing this model myself. I've done it before to show that when you go to the temperate region, this back and forth it's easier, it's one directional. I'm just doing this eco-evolutionary model to look at this exact thing, because when someone who reviewed that paper that I was just telling him about asked the very same question. In fact, the paleontologists who've been studying this say that there is a limit to the season. So seasonality in the higher latitudes will impose a constraint. It gets too cold. So your niche space isn't that high, but if you had, say, 2 species, so like this kind of system, the tropical species initially succeeds because it can just take advantage of the warmer times, and then it has something like antifreeze in its body, like it has the cold tolerance can evolve very quickly, acclimate very quickly, so they can survive. But eventually, if everybody ended up there, then you should have as high diversity over there, but the fact is you evolve because okay, so you can survive, but you can't actually really, in the long term, any mutant that's better adapted to that environment would displace the initial invader, right? So eventually you evolve the temperate niche. And because the temperate niche is wide, only so many species can persist. Yeah, so it's a very good question.
More questions?
Thank you very much for the lecture. The question is about the mortality rate dependent on temperature. I suppose that the curve should behave like for 2 cold temperatures, it should also rise because.
Yes,
well,
of course it does. And I was mentioning that at the beginning without showing a graph. So it rises at a temperature at which species cannot reproduce. So when you put it in the dynamical model, it doesn't matter very much. In fact, I should have, I was in a hurry, so I didn't put the mortality. So I do in these studies, these papers, I do have a mortality curve that goes up at lower temperatures. Where it matters is when a tropical species, for example, goes to a temperate region. It has to be able to tide that period over, and the species that can do that are those with like resistant stages, like resting eggs or other stages, or species that can actually have freeze tolerance. So the thing what people find out though is within a generation they can evolve, they can acclimatize to the lower limit but not to the higher limit. Okay, so it really does matter. And but you can see like a lot of the data people don't either report it because, so if you put it in the model, because they don't reproduce at that time, it gets dropped down. Okay, good question. There's somebody in the back.
So first, thank you for the talk. It was very nice. I was just wondering about the question about the niche, right? So it depends on niche conservatism, right? So and it's also species dependent. So have you tried like to place models back for previous climate, like mid-Holocene or stuff like that, modeling niche, or placing it for future climates and so forth?
I have done the future thing. Now, it's not in here because in order to do that, you can't use this analytical approximation for the innovation criterion. Oh. Because if the environment is changing, you can take a static niche in the future, but then you have to make some assumption about what that niche would be. But you can do that. So you can completely do that. You can say, okay, what I call a thermal specialist now will have shifted in this way or adapted in this way. So the conservatism, though, is actually very interesting. That comes from the adaptation of those underlying traits. So what we say is a conservatism is how species have evolved those traits to maximize fitness in their current or their historical environment. And it's a matter of how quickly they can adapt. Okay?
Right. And so you use several species or several families to do so, or was it for specific species? I mean, to correct for phylogenetic relationships.
Oh wait, so the model is applicable to any, but the empirical example is actually very phylogenetically different species. So it's a good test, but it's something I had happened to have studied in detail.
More questions?
Lots of exercise for you.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. So in this paper where you use also fossil data and more observational data, how did you estimate the parameters? You could not do that experimentally, I suppose.
No, so the only parameters we've used are for the insect system. Now, once I gave a talk about this, and David Jablonski, who's a very famous paleontologist at the University of Chicago, came and said he has the data for the marine bivalves, but when he looked at it, because they are extinct, there's no way to get temperature responses. So you can only make qualitative predictions of extrapolating from where they were at that time to say whether they were thermogenesis or thermospecialists. So the problem with the fossil record is unless you have some way of getting at some approximation of the temperature response, because we know they have to have been conserved. So we know the shapes are the same, right? So you could use a Gaussian, or what you do is you find the nearest relative, extant relative of that species, use the same parameters. So it's something he and I have talked about that we haven't done yet. The only data I've used so far are where we can measure. We measured every single thing, and it took a very long time.
Further questions?
No.
So, okay. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have